The fourth United States aircraft lost in the war with Iran, a tanker's final moments over western Iraq. It was the Ides of March, the 12th, a Thursday. Operation Epic Fury, the American and Israeli campaign to dismantle the Iranian regime's nuclear ambitions, was entering its 13th day. Thousands of sorties had been flown, over 6,000 targets inside Iran had been struck, but war, even when waged with precision munitions and advanced AI-driven targeting, has a gravity of its own. It pulls things down. In the thin, cold air 20,000 feet above the Anbar Desert, two aging KC-135 Stratotankers, aircraft built when Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House, were conducting a routine rendezvous, a handoff of fuel and sortie responsibility deep in friendly airspace. It was a ballet they had performed thousands of times across decades of conflict, from the jungles of Vietnam to the skies over Afghanistan. This time, something went terribly wrong. For the 4 airmen aboard one of those Stratotankers, the war came home not with the flash of an Iranian missile, but in the silent, catastrophic impact of metal on metal, 20,000 feet above the Iraqi sands. To understand the loss of this aircraft, serial number 580101, an airframe delivered to the Air Force in 1959, we must understand the relentless tempo of Operation Epic Fury. The campaign, launched on February 28, 2026, was unlike any the U.S. Air Force had fought since the opening days of Operation Desert Storm. The goal, as articulated by President Trump, was the unconditional surrender of the Tehran regime. To achieve that, Central Command had amassed the largest regional concentration of American military firepower in a generation. Carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, B-2 Spirit bombers operating from Diego Garcia, and hundreds of tactical aircraft, F-15E Strike Eagles, F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-35 Lightning IIs, pounding Iranian air defenses, nuclear facilities, and command centers around the clock. But fighters are thirsty machines. An F-15E, laden with precision-guided munitions, can burn through its internal fuel in under 2 hours. To strike targets deep in Iran and return to bases in the Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula, they need gas. And that gas comes from the tankers, the KC-135 Stratotanker, the backbone of the Air Force's mobility fleet. These are not glamorous aircraft. They are aerial gas stations, bulky, slow, and vulnerable. The KC-135s operating in support of Epic Fury were, on average, over 60 years old. Most had been built between 1958 and 1965. Their wings had been refitted, their engines upgraded to quieter, more efficient turbofans, but their basic airframes were flying antiques. They were crewed by experienced airmen, pilots, co-pilots, and boom operators, whose job was to fly precise racetrack patterns in designated anchor areas, waiting for fighters to pull up and plug in for a drink. By March 12th, the air war had entered a critical phase. Iranian air defenses, while degraded, were still launching surface-to-air missiles. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, grouped under an umbrella organization called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, were firing rockets and loitering munitions at bases hosting U.S. forces. The friendly skies of western Iraq were no longer entirely safe. Earlier in the campaign, the U.S. had already suffered significant non-combat aircraft losses. 3 F-15E Strike Eagles, the tip of the spear, had been mistakenly engaged and destroyed by a Kuwaiti Fa-18 Hornet in the opening days of the war, a devastating friendly fire incident that killed no pilots but cost the Air Force 3 of its most advanced fighters. The loss of a 4th manned aircraft, even a tanker, would be a psychological blow. By the afternoon of March 12th, the tanker task force was operating at maximum capacity, According to CENTCOM statements released later, two KC-135s were transiting western Iraq in loose formation. They were heading to a pre-designated refueling track, a point in the sky where they would orbit and await strike packages returning from missions over Iran. The lead aircraft, call sign Gasman 11, was flying at approximately 21,000 feet. Following about 2 miles behind and slightly lower was Gasman 12, the aircraft that would eventually go down. They were maintaining radio silence, communicating via standard formation flying procedures. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor below. Visibility was good, the air was smooth. What happened next is the subject of an ongoing Air Force investigation, but the physics of the incident are becoming clear. Aerial refueling is a highly choreographed routine. Tankers often fly in close proximity to one another to deconflict airspace and manage the flow of traffic. However, the margin for error at 20,000 feet is zero. The Stratotanker is 136 feet long with a 130-foot wingspan. In the air, distances can be deceiving. The human eye struggles to judge closure rates against a featureless sky. At 1400 hours local time, the two aircraft were scheduled to begin a turn to the north, aligning with the inbound fighter track. It was a standard procedural turn, but as the two massive aircraft began to bank, their paths converged. Preliminary reports from Air Force investigators, shared with reporters from the New York Times, suggested a mid-air collision was the likely cause. An official, speaking on condition of anonymity, stated that the two aircraft made contact. The closing speed between them, as Gasman 12 began to drift slightly high and forward in the turn, may have been as little as 10 or 20 knots. But that was enough for the wingtip of one 120,000-pound jet to slice into the fuselage of another. Gasman 11, the lead aircraft, felt a shudder. The pilots likely saw a flash of metal in their peripheral vision. Alarms would have screamed in the cockpit. On Gasman 12, the situation was immediately catastrophic. The collision tore into the cabin, ripping through the aluminum skin. The aircraft, already 67 years old, had been stressed by decades of takeoffs and landings, of pressurization cycles, of hard use. The structural integrity failed instantly. Aboard Gasman 12, there were 4 crew members: the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and boom operator. Their exact identities have been withheld pending notification of next of kin, but they were part of a generation of airmen who volunteered to serve in a war that was already claiming American lives. As of that week, 7 U.S. troops had been killed in Operation Epic Fury, with approximately 140 wounded, including 8 with life-threatening injuries. For those 4 airmen, there was no time to react, no time to eject. The KC-135 has no ejection seats. No time to mayday. The aircraft came apart in the sky. The moment of impact, the crisis, was not a firefight. It was not an explosion caused by a surface-to-air missile, though Iran-backed militias would later claim responsibility, and Iranian state television would broadcast those claims to a domestic audience hungry for victory. CENTCOM was quick to refute the hostile fire narrative. In an initial statement released within hours, they were emphatic. This was not due to hostile fire or friendly fire. The incident occurred in friendly airspace over a region of isolated desert in western Iraq, but the crisis was no less real for its mechanical cause. The aircraft broke apart. Pieces of wreckage, some large, some small, tumbled toward the earth. The fuselage, or what remained of it, spun down in a death spiral. The desert floor, so featureless from altitude, rushed up to meet it. The crash site was remote, miles from the nearest road, the kind of place where the only sounds are the wind and the occasional bleating of a goat. On Gasman 11, the surviving tanker, the pilots fought to regain control of their own damaged aircraft. They didn't know the full extent of what had happened. They only knew that one of their wingmen was gone. They declared an emergency and immediately broke from the formation, descending rapidly to a lower altitude to assess their own damage and to begin the grim process of accounting. The second KC-135 landed safely at its designated airfield hours later. Its crew would be debriefed, questioned, and offered counseling. They had witnessed something that no airman wants to see. A fellow aircraft, filled with fellow Americans, simply ceased to exist in midair. The crisis, however, was not confined to the sky. On the ground, in the Pentagon War Room, the news landed with a thud. The fourth aircraft, another symbol of American power reduced to a smoldering crater. President Trump was briefed. Commanders at CENTCOM, led by Admiral Brad Cooper, began coordinating the rescue and recovery effort. But they knew, even as they dispatched teams, that this was not a rescue. It was a recovery. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, the solemn machinery of the casualty notification process was set in motion. Teams of officers, dressed in their dress blues, began the long drives to the homes of the four airmen. They would knock on doors, they would deliver the news, they would change families forever. The turning point in this story is not one of heroic combat. There was no last stand, no defiant act of airmanship that saved the day. The turning point is quieter, more human, and in its own way more profound. It is the moment the search and rescue teams reach the wreckage. The Anbar Desert is a harsh environment. In March, temperatures can be moderate during the day, but they plummet at night. The crash site was isolated. The teams, likely drawn from U.S. Air Force personnel stationed at Al-Assad or other bases in the region, moved across the sand with purpose. They were not looking for survivors. The nature of the crash precluded that. They were looking for their own. When they arrived, they were met with a scene of devastation, wreckage scattered over a wide area, the unmistakable signs of a high-velocity impact. But amid the twisted metal and the burning fuel, they did something that defines the military profession. They conducted their search with reverence. They treated the site as sacred ground. The turning point is not a tactical victory, but a moral one. It is the commitment of the United States military to never leave its fallen behind. Every piece of wreckage was cataloged, every belonging of the four airmen was recovered, and the remains of the crew, as much as could be found, were gathered with dignity. This is the moment the narrative shifts from the physics of a mid-air collision to the human cost of war. The four airmen were not just serial numbers or crew positions. They were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. They were the products of small towns and big cities. They had joined the Air Force for different reasons: patriotism, education, a sense of purpose, and they had ended their service in the same way, in a fiery instant, over a foreign desert, doing a job that is essential but often thankless. The surviving tanker crew, the men of Gasman 11, would later be debriefed, supported, and returned to duty. They carry with them the memory of that moment. They are the living witnesses to the fragility of life at 20,000 feet. The crash of the KC-135 Stratotanker on March 12, 2026, became the fourth loss of a U.S. manned aircraft in Operation Epic Fury. It followed the three F-15E Strike Eagles downed by friendly fire over Kuwait and joined a list of over a dozen MQ-9 Reaper drones that had been shot down or destroyed in the conflict. The official narrative, established by CENTCOM, is that this was an accident, a mid-air collision between two tankers conducting routine operations in friendly airspace. No hostile fire, no enemy action, simply the terrible, unavoidable friction of war, the convergence of two large objects in a vast sky. But in the information war, narratives are contested. Within hours of the crash, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, an umbrella group of Iran-backed armed factions, issued a statement claiming they had shot down the aircraft in defense of our country's sovereignty and airspace. The next day, Iranian state television amplified this claim, citing a spokesman for the Khatam al-Anbiya military headquarters affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who said the aircraft was struck by missiles fired by resistance factions. To this day, the U.S. military denies these claims. The evidence, according to Air Force investigators, points to a mechanical or procedural failure, not a missile. But the very existence of competing narratives speaks to the fog of war. In a conflict fought with AI-assisted targeting and sixth-generation fighters, the simplest explanation, a collision, sometimes carries less weight than the dramatic story of a malicious victory. For the families of the 4 crew members, the resolution is not found in CENTCOM statements or Iranian propaganda. It is found in the flag-draped transfer cases that arrived at Dover Air Force Base in the days following the crash. It is found in the folded flags presented to grieving parents and spouses. It is found in the silent rows of white crosses that will eventually mark their graves. The legacy of this incident is a cautionary tale. It reminds us that war, even high-tech war, is a human endeavor, and human endeavors are subject to human error. The tankers were old, the tempo was relentless, the margins were thin, and on a Thursday afternoon in March, those margins disappeared. The names of the 4 airmen have not been publicly released as of this recording, pending family notifications. But they are not forgotten. They are part of the cost of defending a nation, the cost of projecting power halfway around the world, the cost of Operation Epic Fury. This was just one of countless untold stories from a war that continues to unfold. The conflict with Iran is far from over. The sorties continue to fly, the tankers continue to refuel them, and the risks remain. 4 airmen went to work on March 12, 2026, expecting to do a difficult, dangerous job. They did not return. Their story, and the stories of so many others in this and every war, deserve to be remembered. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Iran War. Subscribe to this channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.